I'm Sora Han, and I'm faculty in CLS and Conflict, and I, with Liz, co-founded the Poetic Justice Cluster in partnership with Lifted. Is here. After I do a brief introduction for just the reason why I invited everyone to come and sort of think about, celebrate the curatorial work of poetic justice on our campus, I'll have everyone do brief introductions. So poetic justice, we started the work on poetic justice about 4 years ago, writing a proposal to hire a cluster of faculty who would come to our campus to really think about, to bring their research expertise and think creatively about how to use research, teaching, and service to, sort of challenge the way that incarceration and punishment and border surveillance is sort of baked into our institutional lives, and really question the ways that what we do on our campus in service of the students that come and the larger public that we serve, to really sort of put our expertise together around this very present social issue. So 4 years ago, that was the sort of crux of our proposal. We were able to bring amazing faculty to campus over the next 2 years or so. Those two faculty, Coleman, Collins, and Mercy Romero over there, are part of now the Poetic Justice faculty. And now we're sort of taking this moment, and the exhibit Intimacies Between Continents is an opportunity to celebrate the work we have done over the past 3 years, and also kind of think deeply and reflect on the mode of curation as something central that has sort of cut across and brought together students and faculty and staff across institutional disciplinary comes on this campus. I think that it's one of the most effective and vibrant interdisciplinary projects that's emerged, at least during my 15 years that I've been here at UC Irvine. So with that, because we are a very mighty but also small gathering of people here to reflect on the role of art in challenging mass incarceration, I thought maybe we could just go around, do brief introductions. And then after that, I want to just immediately jump into Alexis and Joanne talking about the exhibit you curated, and Liz, and then okay. Right. So we'll start.
Hi, I'm Carmen. I'm Carmen Rader. I'm faculty in Criminology, and I run Lifted, which is the University of California Bachelor's Program for incarcerated students. And yeah, I've worked really closely with Sora and Liz, and really excited to see all of this coming to life here. And I also worked with Joanne and Alexis on the project they'll talk
about. I'm Palmi Sen, I'm Coleman's friend. I'm also an artist and a professor at Rowland College in Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Coleman Collins. Sort of part of the Poetic Justice Cluster and assistant professor here in the art department, and I curated the show.
Hi, I'm Liz Glynn. I'm faculty in the art department. I teach sculpture and sculpture and performance.
I'm Alexis Rowland. I'm a fifth year PhD candidate in CLS, Criminology, and I worked on the Locked Up and Locked Down exhibit as a part of the prison project.
I'm Joanne DeCaro. I'm also a graduate student in the Criminology department in my 7th year now. Also worked on excited to talk about it.
My name is Mercy Romero. I'm faculty also in CLS. I'm sorry, Coleman as part of the Public Justice Cluster hire. And I'm very happy to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm just down from the these are the questions we were asked. Just
Thank you.
pictures.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. If you haven't had a chance to walk around the exhibit, I really encourage you to after we're done today. So maybe Joanne and Alexis, we can start with you to kind of recreate the Locked Up exhibition in the Catalyst Gallery.
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
We were very lucky there that we got to partner with the students in doing the Catalyst Gallery. So that was also a special moment, is that we got the Catalyst Gallery, and it was where undergraduate students host their exhibits, and they very graciously invited us to be a part of them. So we got to work with them, they helped us promote it.
Just as a note on that too, it was actually very hard to find a space on campus to host that project. And I think there was a lot of, it was difficult to sort of communicate the vision for what that looked like a proper gallery space. There was a lot of, I think academia has this will be like a library event, or like this will be like a mixer in this space, and there'll be a podium, and it was like, okay, sure. Where are the walls? Where are we gonna hang this stuff?
Can you describe the exhibit?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, we had, there's a few different components. I think really one of the standout components to it that Alexis really created was that we actually got from eBay real prison phones. So the phones that you use in there, they look like old-fashioned pay phones, but actual phones that came from carceral facilities throughout the nation. And Alexis rewired those phones to where they played phone calls from incarcerated people that we got on prison projects. You would pick up a payphone and you listen to stories. All of a sudden it would click and you would start hearing voices from people from behind prison walls. And that was a real kind of motivation, big motivations for the project, is that you're actually interacting with incarcerated voices directly and in a way that's really kind of hard to escape. Like it's like you're hearing it around you. And we'll talk about it.
Sure, yeah. So there's aspects of it that were really documenting the stories that we were receiving as part of the project, the stories that were obviously the recorded ones, people called in the hotline, those were on the phones, but also we had a lot of artwork that people sent to us. People sent in artifacts, objects that were important to them, things that they made for us, a lot of art, and we also displayed that in various ways, in terms of sometimes we sort of collage them in these larger acrylic frames, and others were sort of blown up, people could see. And then there were aspects as well that really documented sort of the project itself, such as a sort of sculptural display of a fraction of the rejected letters that we sent out. As part of the project, we sent out letters eliciting stories from people inside, and
we sent out tens of thousands of letters. We spent $20,000 to $30,000 just on stamps. So for example, some facilities just rejected almost all of our letters, and so we had this mass collection of these letters that never even made it inside for people to see. And for some of them were legitimate, kind of like the person was at court, the person was no longer out there. But there was other ones where just for whatever reason they decided those letters were not getting inside. And so just documenting that lack of communication, the gatekeeping there of voices, both coming out, but also outside voices coming in.
Yeah, so it's like a documentation of not only like the project and what we're doing in a very material way, but also in the sense that like it is a reflection of the very reasons that a project is important, right? The inaccessibility, the restriction that's like necessary to the carceral project. So there were several different components, and then, but it was in many ways very traditional space, white walls, little art cards, And
We can also talk about that it went to ASC, so.
yeah, there's a second iteration.
So maybe just for people who are not necessarily familiar with prison pandemic as a research project, maybe the context for that can be introduced as well.
Sure.
Sure. So, prison pandemic is that in the early parts of the pandemic, as soon as it hit, before it even really hit some of the carceral facilities very bad, like St. Quentin, there was a huge outbreak there and many deaths. Our team together, including the chairman over here, are all people that worked with currently or formerly incarcerated people and had connections, and many on the team have personal connections with people inside carceral facilities. And everyone who's had experience with the carceral system and with loved ones or others inside knew that the pandemic was going to hit these facilities horrifically, and that there was not going to be measures in place and the ability to keep people safe. And so we collectively, at first, we decided that we wanted to just really fundraise for personal protective care to go inside. That we knew that there would be a lack of that, and they're hearing that there was a lack of it inside. So initially, it started as a fundraising. We were able to raise, I believe, around $10,000 and get that gear inside the 3 local prisons that are closest to UCI. But in that process, we really were starting to hear from people inside these facilities that just were desperate to be heard, that we were asking for their voices to be heard for like a promotional video to raise money, but they were just saying, no, we want our voice to be heard. We don't care if it's a promotional video, we don't care what it's for, like, we want outsiders to know what is happening inside these facilities. And that's when we realized that there needed to be a way to just collect voices in real time, that we decided less for a traditional academic project where we're coming in like, a set of questions and trying to do a systemic kind of analysis of this population. And instead we decided to create this archival project where we were just getting these letters and phone calls in real time and putting them out on a website as quick as we could. So that way the public, lawyers, organizations, advocacy groups could know what was happening inside facilities. We ended up collecting about 4,000 phone calls and letters. We ran a hotline Monday through Friday from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. for a few years that collected phone calls from people inside. And we also, without really intending to, we created a huge amount of letter archive, because at first we had letters as an alternative or to ask questions, but it became, especially with how restricted phone access was in prisons and other carceral facilities at that time, letters became a huge part of the project. So now we have this very large archive that we're working on making permanent, both with the libraries here. We have amazing partners with the libraries here, and then also our own website to where you can have access to all of these artifacts. And just really, we're the largest now archive of pandemic conditions in any carceral facility, certainly in the nation, possibly the world. Like that, we have this amazing, gigantic collection from all facilities in California, from state jails, ICE facilities, federal facilities. So it's this massive archive that we've undertaken, and the art exhibit both here on campus and then eventually at the American Society of Criminologists is really as a point to get some of that material out and to expose it to people, and that way they're having a way to interact with it. I also say really quickly that another important piece that we did after the exhibit here is that we created a book of some of the stories that were included in the exhibit, and we sent those books back inside to incarcerated people. And that was very important for us, that we know incarcerated people can't come to these exhibits. They can't, most of them, aren't allowed, they can't look at the website. They have no idea how their stories are being used after theirs. We sent them thank you notes after they initially participated, but they're not getting to see all these end results. So we wanted to create an end result of a product that they'd actually be able to see, that they could look and see theirs and their and people like them, their stories.
So maybe we can jump to 2023 then, which is when Affective Resistance was installed in this space.
Actually not in this space,
Oh, not
but
in this space, okay.
the art department has kind of a unique structure in that we have galleries as kind of galleries are kind of our labs as faculty, and we have 2 other galleries. Part of the year they so advanced undergrads and grads, and the other group here, they feature what's called exhibitions. So this is one of them. We have two other spaces, which are the University Art Gallery and the Rome Gallery, and I worked with Alberto Boulay, who was one of our MFAs who finished his MFA at the end of 2023, and now joining the PhD cohort of the Performance Studies program at UCLA. So we found out yesterday. It's very exciting. But Alberto was a working artist who was also a member of the Underground Scholars Organization. So Alberto had been incarcerated for 13 years prior to coming out, getting his AB first, and where he was the valedictorian of his community college, going to UCLA to do his BFA, and then coming to us for his MFA. He's an artist that works between sculpture and performance, as am I. So when we started the Poetic Justice Initiative, we were thinking about ways to work with the underground scholars and also to activate the gallery spaces. And I'll say that also the gallery program at UCI under Julie Carson has been really committed to showing work that may not have a space in either more commercially oriented galleries where there's kind of a profit-related motivation just for their own economic survival, as well as even some museum spaces where you would just have fundraised to keep a large museum operation, have that pressure to produce programming that board members are supportive of. And so here, where we're in an academic institution, we can really show work that's quite political and critical. And so we particularly wanted to look at performance as a site of resistance and thinking about a way that we could use the gallery spaces to show works that in several cases were documented on video but had been created in remote locations and then recorded for circulation to talk about histories that aren't necessarily visible traditionally in spaces like the kind of modern tradition. So the other thing I would say is that this work is happening in the context of already a lot of really excellent curatorial work done by who are professional curators, which I am not, including, I just want to credit, Thelma Goldman's work at the Studio Museum in Harlem, credit our own Bridget Cook's, who's an art historian and also a professor in African studies, but a lot of research-based curatorial work. And Coleman, I mean, people talk about this, and I do this work as a practicing artist, just as part of my work, I go and see a lot of exhibitions. So Berto and I were curating early on just work that we'd seen and were excited about, but also felt like hadn't necessarily made it to Southern California, and putting that in dialogue with some work that we knew was here, because I think a lot of the exhibitions that have been happening in the last 5 years or so in the States were really focused on the African American experience and the relationship to the Confederate monuments and the relationship to the legacies of slavery, but from a very specific American version of that experience, whereas when we were looking at shows in Europe, there included work by the Benin-born Belgian-based artist Pelagie Abouidi, a piece that she showed in Documenta that was looking at kind of the origins of slavery in ancient Greece and putting that in dialogue with a performance she had shot in these caves that had early hominid fossils and early cave paintings in South Africa. And it just, this was when the piece was first shown, it was in Greece, thinking at kind of that moment of the Greek debt crisis, shown very in close physical proximity to the Acropolis. When I think about Greece as kind of this beacon and symbol of democracy, and in her work, she's sort of talking about the inextricable link between slavery and democracy. So we included that work as well as performances by the Jersey-based artist Nugent Smith, who created these different performance pieces where he's activating these former plantation sites in Barbados, and just sort of using his body to kind of call attention to these histories that are otherwise dormant in a sense. And then he also included these flags that were created one of the flags in a series of flags thinking about a unified Caribbean state and some kind of the conflicts between post-colonial Caribbean nations and kind of the fight to shake the legacy of colonialism in that context. We also included in the show work by some LA-based artists that were kind of using abstraction and materialism, partly because figuration has been a very dominant movement in perhaps more commercial spaces, and we included work by Alicia Pillar, who's a Southern California-based artist that was looking at kind of histories of both climate change and also racial inequity, kind of in juxtaposition of these massive, kind of sprawling abstract sculptures, as well as work by Rodney McMillian, who's faculty at UCLA, works with often a combination of found objects, and these sort of latex boards, but thinking about the history of abstraction as a site of resistance. So we think about both performance and abstraction, wanting to bring these works together in conversation with UCI, and using the discursive space that is the university and the community around to kind of have a different conversation about these issues.
Coleman, would you like to sort of, for those of us who haven't yet walked through?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, the exhibition came into being kind of similar to Liz, working as an artist, a practitioner more than a curator.
Yeah.
It came out of familiarity with these artists and their practices, and the sort of curiosity about what could happen if they were all in a space together. Daniel Zeen's work, which is over there, it's kind of the anchor of the show. It's an older work that I've been quite familiar with for a while, that kind of is a reenactment of the building of a mini castle in Ghana. And she does it with her cousin through a sort of re-performance of that event, which is notable because the Portuguese shipped the castle in pieces from sort of this modular fashion from Portugal. And so she does a sort of reenactment of that in Houston in the housing complex. And it's kind of tying in toward what was happening then, ongoing sort of messages of creation. And then Africanus' work. So Danielle teaches at UCSD. Africanus is an assistant professor at RISD. And he's a Ghanaian American who grew up here, but is also half Nigerian. And so he makes these sculptures that are, on the one hand, made in tandem with artists in Ghana. So he takes these forms and things here, and then have them done through a sort of lost wax brass casting process in Ghana. But the forms themselves are hybrids between traditional African sculptural forms and American basketball trophies. But the chests themselves, that you can also see, this 3-channel work, the video installation, they're all actually archival chests from the British colonization of Ghana. So the works are sort of embedded within these artifacts of this process, so that these chests were used to ship goods in that period, and they kind of most of them are over 100 years old. So it's a kind of interesting way that the work both performs the process of this kind of cross-Atlantic movement, but then it's embedded within the artifact that is. And then Sula's work, I think, is really useful in a different way in dialogue with Danielle's. Sula also works with these domestic spaces, so sometimes with houses, sometimes with picture windows, and within the windows of both the house and these portholes, as she calls them, on the wall, you can see these images that are derived from early colonial accounts of, the encounter of the colonists with people, like indigenous people in Central and South America. But also, she does a lot of playing with horror tropes. So for Sula, she's really interested in the way that the sort of fear of the other, often racialized, gets played out in horror films, and she's really connecting that with the colonial encounter. So I thought that there were ways to kind of bring these different nodes, like housing, gentrification, colonial encounter, exchange, and objects that sometimes are like very part of that process, but other times index it through what they're depicting or the manner in which they're rendered. So I thought it was really useful, to see what could happen when they're all in a space together. And I want to believe that there's a kind of, sociality or a kind of connection that can be produced between objects and between these different circumstances. So that's the kind of impetus for the show, and it was a really interesting process. There was a lot of logistical work, especially doing things within the university, trying to deal with insurance, trying to deal with shipping, contracts, etc. Luckily, Sasha Youssef is not here, who's the gallery director, was really helpful and instrumental in that process. But yeah, it's just a pleasure to have that. So,
Yeah.
That looks great.
What I find really interesting, and thank you for sharing with us and kind of recreating in our minds the exhibitions that are in the past now. But what is interesting to me that came across as you were all speaking is that curatorial practice is something that extended from other sites of practice that aren't necessarily the sort of professional role, and that it serves a different function. I think in the case of Prison Pandemic, it was to kind of honor and respond to the demand of incarcerated people to want to engage a larger public, but also for whatever reasons, whether it's the research communities are working at a different pace, and that journalists also have their own interests, that curation became the kind of ethical mode of responding to that demand, which I think is just fascinating. And Liz, this idea that I think sort of is in conversation with the themes and stakes and conceptual ideas in this exhibit, where the performative nature of objects and different kinds of texts that one might put in a space then becomes an extension of the performances that were recorded and then brought here in a kind of different temporal kind of frame. And then Coleman, your exhibit, which really is demanding us to question the boundary between what are the intimate parts of our lives and what are the feelings of intimacy existentially, and the kind of larger expanse of the circuits of global capital and exchange. The way that those are kind of reversed, inverted, restaged, doubled, I think that is also a part of this question of performance and audience and tapping into different temporalities as we deal with these ongoing, urgent, historical, social legacies of oppression. So, With that, I think that maybe what I want to do is sort of ask you to expand or even elaborate on, Liz, what you said, which is that for artists who work in an academic context, galleries are like labs, which is the first time I've ever heard anything like that. And I love that reconfiguration or reconceptualization of even how I understand myself now in this space. And so what are the sort of fundamental elements that are necessary for a gallery as lab?
I mean, so when we're talking about a gallery, we have the physical space, but then it's also the social space.
Yeah.
Fundamentally. And there's a lot that, I mean, we refer to behind the scenes and sort of infrastructural support and everything else, but I think there's also just the presence of you all in the space coming to experience the exhibition. Because fundamentally, work is sort of one of the theories of kind of post-studio art, is the idea that the work is completed by the viewer in that interaction, and that the work isn't sort of like in the modernist paradigm, that the work kind of is itself, sort of singular, but that rather thinking about a work that sort of, like each of us is bringing our own different experience to it, and part of what's happening in the space, especially in the community that is society, come together from different backgrounds, and there is that sort of people are bringing different things to each piece, and the curator or the artist curator is bringing their research in and bringing in information that the artists in the exhibition have shared. So you're kind of learning through that process, but that also that there's what happens between in that relationality. Because the experiment, in a sense, is kind of when you put these things together, kind of what synergies are produced, or what, like how are you seeing, like I think Coleman was just moving to with Sula's work in relationship to Danielle Dean's. Like I've seen actually this sculpture in a very different exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York, and it's in that context, which was like an emerging artist exhibition, it sort of poses different questions in dialogue. In
so the room was painted.
The room was
the walls were painted. I saw that show too. Very different context. It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting too because these works they exist in different contexts. So everything around it really changes how it, sort of speaking. Sorry to interrupt, but I was just thinking about that because in that show was about a year ago maybe, so I was in New York and saw it, and I don't know that I would have done this, because it feels very different when it's like a multicolored room and there's like all stuff. But yeah, but those decisions are about where things are placed, I think. It's interesting, I don't know how it was for you, Liz, but I've often been on the other side of like having given up a little bit of vacancy about where my work is or what it's in conjunction with, and maybe wishing it was 5 feet to the left or maybe further away from something else that I thought might, especially when you're working with audio or video, because it's soundly, it's like, and so being in the position of deciding where things went, it felt like a lot of responsibility, I think. And trying to respect people's wishes while also, obeying the dictates of the gallery, or how high are the lights, right? Like, how can we use spotlights? Can you have the house lights on or not? Be a video, so that we need a little bit of darkness, right? It's probably a little darker than you usually would have, but then also the house is lit, so that also has its own light source. Just trying to figure out how to balance all those things was interesting for me to be in that position.
But there's a politic to the space, right? And what you're referring to is sort of like when you put this next to that, or you give this much space, or you're shining light on this, or you're not, walling this off. Like it's subtle, and it's something as a viewer you may not notice within those decisions where the argument is constructed.
Yeah.
And like I think one of the debates right now in museum practice is just like the question of linear narrative. You know, and like in the new building, for lack of a better building about a year, they've actually constructed the architecture in such a way that you can't walk through on kind of like a single storyline, like that it kind of denies you that possibility, and so it forces the curators, some of them for 30 years, to curate differently, and that space is it's not a coincidence. And so, like, I mean, here we have a really open kind of Kunsthalle model, but also just in your decision to leave a lot of space between things as opposed to putting them right on top of, 3 feet apart, colorful abstract paintings. Like it changes how we read things.
Yeah, and it's a problem because it's a hallway. You know? So it's like they come in, there has to be something there. And so if that was here, it's a very loud work. So it would kind of figuring out how to balance the audio, and figuring out how to balance the different sort of lines of sight. In this L space, it's tricky because there's some things that literally speak, and then other things that need to speak but don't have sound. And there's lighting questions, and don't want to put the house in front of too close to that, because otherwise those things be right together because all these house forms.
Yeah.
Even though there's a rhyme, you need to have some space.
Yeah.
So I felt like, and I'm sure it can catalyst, right? It's a smaller space. You need to it's a really a question of inches, figuring out how far you have to go. And it can be very, a huge difference having something a foot closer versus 5 feet.
But this is the phones.
Yeah.
And catalyst, the decision, and a big decision of like having seen versus not being seen. You have to stand, listen, and how long is someone going to stand there, and just will someone really depend on the phone? And sort of all of those are how do you let someone know it's okay? There are all these kind of like little social cues that are really important for the interactivity to kind of flow in these spaces.
This seems like a really good time to move into the ASC. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah, because this is about the politics of space.
Yeah. I think just to jump off the last question too, about like this lab is gallery or vice versa even. I think Prism Endemic really comes from its place and like also the exhibit, and that like it was trying to do what research couldn't, right? Like the speed of academia is paralyzing. And in a situation like that, we needed something really, really fast, to stand something up really fast and to collect very fast and to disseminate really fast. And like research can't do that, it's impossible. It turns out. It turns out. So this is like, it was kind of like a lab, but it was kind of, you're distancing ourselves from research very specifically because this offered ways to do things that we needed to do it. We felt there was like this ethical mandate for it. And I think the exhibit really actually reflects that too. There's a sort of insurgent quality to it. I felt like kind of was back to art school again, where I was like trying to set something up with like no money and resources, and like we had a lot more than I did as an undergrad, let me tell you. But in like my friend's gallery across town, just like taping stuff together, like getting into a space and installing in like 5 hours, and then so that's when that really went into overdrive and went to ASC, the American Society of Criminologists. It's the largest criminology conference in the world, probably, I imagine. If anyone is unfamiliar with criminology here, probably most people.
Yes.
Me too, kind of. It's a fairly conservative social science, and there's a lot of institutionalists who come to these practitioners at these things who are working within carceral spaces and are share very different policy than many of ours in our project. And so it was a very interesting opportunity to be able to present there. It is an interesting, but sort of a necessarily conflicting intervention in that space.
The first art exhibit that we know of in AFC, so really this spot where a conference where even though they're talking about incarcerated people or people subjected to the criminal legal system, and there's, first of all, very rarely people who've experienced that in those spaces, their voices are not often heard. There's been recent attempts, and at this last conference, as we were saying, there's probably more voices that were, formerly incarcerated or others people who've experienced voices in the past. But this is a space where that population is talked about, but they are not listened to. And so I think it was this amazing intervention to have Alexis's phone is there and have people actually listening to the voices of incarcerated people. And as you were saying earlier, that really for from the depleted battery of this phones, that they are being used for 5 or 6 hours straight every day for multiple days, and having populations that would not be in art spaces typically, that would not be listening to incarcerated voices normally, and having them be heard because of art, because of the allowance of this kind of lab and this unusual space. We're in an exhibitors hall, so there are people, booksellers kind of pitching their academic books, and then us. And I will just say also briefly that I think it did two really different interesting things. I think for when we had the exhibit here, it really allowed students to interact with these voices. And I think that's actually what in the letters and the phone calls, people calling from prisons and other facilities really wanted. They wanted to be heard by these students. When we first started this project, I wasn't how sure how they would feel about college students writing them, if they would think, oh, this is some elitist kids who are, what do they have to do with my life, or why are they writing me? But no, in the letters back, they were so excited to hear from college students. They wanted to communicate with college students. They wanted to have this connection with really people their own age, and so I think by having the exhibit here really was a way to make those connections, and I think in the ways that the population that was writing to us was really excited and really kind of maybe desperate to kind of have this kind of peer connections. And then at ASC, we had a completely different kind of connection there. That they were being brought to a completely different audience that maybe the people who contributed didn't imagine addressing. But I'm sure a huge segment would be very happy that this population that normally doesn't ever hear their voices and could in fact be in opposition to what they're saying, were able to be heard that way.
Yeah, the ways we have to go about those are very different, right? In the ASC space, we very literally it was sort of this almost a coercive takeover of that space.
Describe the actual installation.
Sure, yeah.
This is
so there is it's an exhibit hall and a hotel,
right?
right?
Hardware store.
This is like it's like a Marriott or something like that. And this is in San Francisco, downtown. So it's it's basement. There's a very large exhibit space. It's very classic. It's got the sort of curtain separators between all of the booksellers, etc. And we very literally did sort of take over this space. There was a lot of confusion of whether we were able to install and how we were to install and what our limitations are. But we literally constructed 4 walls that were studded, dry, sheetrocked, mudded, painted, and I drove them up to San Francisco.
By we,
Sorry?
I said by we, you mean I.
And we unloaded from the car, and all of a sudden there was a thing, why are you bringing these walls in here? And we're it's just ignore it, bro. We're supposed to be here, I swear. And there's this, so we eventually had to I don't know, it felt very much like
Like gorilla
it
stuff.
felt super, yeah, and then to set these up, driving 7 hours, setting up shop after all that, and then having to install everything realistically, and then troubleshoot. A couple of the phones went down. Soldering on the floor of the music, of this new emergent gallery space or whatever. And it was and then it was this week had to force people to, we smuggled in these voices, right? We like literally brought in people's voices into the space in suitcases, and then like set up a space that had the aesthetics of legitimacy, right? This like, still like cute, right? We sort of imported a small version of that into this. And so people could sort of have this unexpected encounter.
Yeah, they did not know. Like they were there to go to the exhibitors hall, and instead they're being confronted as soon as they walked in with art, which they were not expecting, and with the voices of incarcerated people, which they were not expecting either. So it was a confrontational, experience, and I think in a necessary and good way. And that one of the only ways I think about we can get incarcerated voices in that space is the confrontational.
It's also it's confrontational, also not at all, right? It's like the idea was like, okay, we're like get it in there, and then they'll have the opportunity to gently walk over there and like pick up a phone and like happen upon a really emotional experience potentially. So it's like, yeah, we had to really force our way in there and make this thing happen, but like also just to set up a space in which you could have an encounter that was like, that felt so natural, to like stumble upon something and have a motivating experience. So it was like, yeah, a lot of different stuff going on to try to reach this entirely different audience.
Yeah. What were the kinds of messages, or what were the kinds of stories that you hear in the recordings?
They really run the gamut. A lot of them were just about people's experiences of COVID-19 while incarcerated, people talking about the conditions of confinement, the lack of medical care, things that of that nature. There was very specifically tried to cover a range of like positionalities. For instance, there was like calls from a transgender woman who was inside, who was talking about like access to healthcare, being very afraid, a lot of visitation conversations about how they haven't been able to talk to their family or friends, or they feel abandoned, about the fear of dying,
The emotional spectrum too, of some people just kind of giving the facts, like I want my testimony and I want this to be recorded, to some people being very angry about the issues, to some people, crying, and you can actually hear the student answer the phone call crying as well, because of how difficult these stories are to hear.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was just listening to you too. I was like thinking like, it's interesting to talk about like it isn't curation art as artistic practice, right? And we're like, it felt very much like, how do we? It didn't feel like art. It felt like museum curation or something. It felt very different. It's like these objects, and we're like, we gotta show people these objects, right? Like this is good. There's good stuff in here. Like please. It's like taking data and making it really tasty. And as opposed to like, yeah, I don't know. It's very different, and very different from my past experience as an artist and as a curator.
I mean, I think that this being sort of the first sculpture to draw in someone who would wander into this space. I mean, on the first impression of it, it is the light, the warmth of the light. It draws you to it. It sort of invokes an experience of coming home, warmth, a desire to peer into the house. In the same way that, where these strategies or how you sort of unsettle just enough to get someone to come over to the booth to pick up the phone, right? And then once you peer in, you realize that the sort of dominant signification of such a warm light actually carries with it something much more disturbing and unsettling as you learn more about the materials of the sculpture, etc. And so that sets up already a different kind of more paradoxical expectation about what signifies as intimacy or the domestic versus what signifies sort of global circles of capital and expropriation. And I felt a similar uncanny. And this is, so when I was sort of going through the exhibits or preparing for today's conversation, there were words that came up in the pamphlet for the exhibit. Words like homing in, adult movement, the uncanny, which in German is unheimlich, which is, if you literally translate it, means unholy, and that unsettling quality of walking through a space and having to peer in the people, sort of that illicit desire to look, which is about the space of or intimacy, a part of intimacy, was echoed when you were describing the activity of curation at ASC, which is that you were bringing in walls, which is the sort of opposite sort of idea or movement of what we think of when we think of prison abolition or prison reform, which is that we want to work without walls. But you're like, to get there, we have to put these walls up in the middle of this conference. That the paradoxical, thought process that curation enables, I think, is what is different about exhibition spaces and the sociality that they can generate, because many other spaces require us to kind of resolve these paradoxical scales through which domination and structural violence and the afterlives of, slavery and colonialism continue to, insinuate themselves in these abstract forms. So, anyway, I wanted to just kind of summarize. Yes.
Well, and just thinking about the sort of smuggling in the walls, or using the walls, and sort of masquerading as this sort of form of cultural legitimacy to do something quite subversive. But I think about what Africanus used to the British colonial chess, and the fact that there's like Benjamin Bucco has a very complicated way of articulating this. These are just sort of the act of confiscating this thing which has this really complicated history, but then sort of infusing it with something that functions as a counterpoint to that history, while keeping the thing intact so that we kind of can't escape that history. We're sort of constantly reminded of the history of British colonialism, and like when I see that or this chess, like I think about the domesticity of and the kind of quotidian nature of so many of these acts of smuggling or kind of collecting in the spirit of like the Grand Tour and so forth, and like the almost like domestic colonialism in some sense, but the way that in the work like Africanus is you're pointing to all of these problematic histories, but also kind of transforming them materially and conceptually.
Yeah, I think it's useful, maybe also because you refer to the materials, to say that the house is cast, it's primarily sugar, and the bricks are salt. So there's a Sula from Minnesota whose work is, I think she started working with that after doing some sort of family genealogy and learning a bit about ancestral work and sugar plantation materials. So there's a material way there's a way that the material is sort of embedded within the work. And then it has all these kind of weird effects. So like a lot of these houses have warped with heat, they're very difficult to maintain, very fragile to ship. We kept it pretty cold in here actually, because it actually like, you can see that even this has there's a kind of fragility to it, because of the warping of the materials. So I like the way that the words change. There's a kind of fragility to domesticity that is sort of performed by the word over time. And yeah.
I mean, to kind of pick up on the question of abstraction and performance that you raised, affective resistance. I mean, it struck me that also that sugar and salt, that these containers, which are actually the relics of a certain historical period, that are, the kind of formal apparatus of exchange and travel, and the kinds of intercontinental movements that required these forms to ship whatever, right? That part of what we're dealing with in the intimacy of the objects together is having to denaturalize forms and fungible goods that are totally represented as well in the video work. Like the fungibility of form, how they insinuate themselves at every scale, that it is not just a matter of these removed processes of capital exchange, but are right there. So when I first encountered the trophies, I wondered if they were sort of medicine cabinets, and I looked around the door to see if there was a mirror, because the form is familiar even in the history of it, and the works inside of it are not immediately. So I just wanted to talk about the reflection as a continuation of our discussion. So I guess I wanted to, I think that we should just open it up to have a discussion in whatever direction you all wanted to take it, but we've been trying to let the art also kind of inform the ways that we are taking stock of curation as a larger social practice.
I have a question about this, Rowland. I think when you mentioned that you were that was area of something you were familiar with. Was there a particular artist or specific work that you began thinking about and showing it, or did you already have? What was the stuff?
I think, I had seen all of their recent work. So I had a show last year. She got a show actually just closed last week. Danielle's work I've known for some years. And Africanus had a show in DC last year. With these works are all from his most recent show. So I think it was kind of like a lot of different things that were swirling around in my head. And there was another work of Danielle's that I think is also fantastic called Bazaar, which is the first work of hers I saw, which was made after this, but it's similar video and with these physical installations. So I was really thinking about that work because it's a lot about the sort of relationship between France and the Caribbean, and particularly about the goods that are sold at a particular French department store. Anyway, that work was shown in San Diego, at MoCA San Diego pretty recently, and I was like, all right, I don't want to show something that's been in Southern California so recently, or just something that's never been seen. Even though I think the Hammer owns the video, this video in the collection, they've never shown the installation. So I just was kind of thinking about first, like, what did I see that I enjoyed, and there was maybe a laundry list of like 10. Then, I spoke to a bunch of different artists, some of whom either already were going to show, like I spoke to Tiana Clouden, Tiana King Cloud, who had an installation where she goes back to Nigeria with this kind of spiritual object. But that she already had plans for how that was going to be shown, that was coming up. So it was a lot of different decisions that were made, partly based on what was available and what had been seen, and then how they could kind of relate to each other conceptually. But it started with me just being someone who's basically seeing a lot of art all the time, and thinking about, and just kind of like the different connections that would go with that.
I've heard a lot about you all discussing the ways, all the many different signal patterns in curating and how one thing can, set off the spark of a exhibition project or an installation project. And it made me curious for each of you who your audience was, because all of these signifiers send certain messages out. In particular, your ideal audience would be for these particular exhibitions. And obviously the site informs who the audiences would be, but who was like your ideal audience in these exhibitions?
I would say for me, working with incarcerated families or populations, when I've done this work, I've also done an exhibit with another group at the University of Chicago Logan Center that was about incarceration, and in other projects. Really, my goal is always to create an exhibit where the community can recognize themselves, the work, where like they could come, where they could recognize their experiences and have this shared collective experience. I think that there's something really magical in both like archives, our oral history projects, our different spaces where these stories become a collective story. They go from that individual story to a collective experience, and to where you can really, I think, start to understand your own narrative in relation to these other narratives in a way that you couldn't in isolation or just with your family. And so for me, that's the goal, is always to be able to create a space that's welcoming and receptive and designed in a way that the community can see themselves in that moment.
Can I just follow up with who is the community?
For me, it's formerly incarcerated people, but that's the prime community. Second to that, I think would be students and people just who have direct access to the justice system, like people who are involved in it in some way. So it'd be touching people who actually have a lived experience, whatever side that's on, and that way they can view their experience and reinform that overall with how they're interacting with those spaces.
Yeah, follow up by saying, I think, so as like a incarceration researcher and someone who has many hats in the space, I think that they're constantly reckoning with this sort of necessary component of incarceration, which is it is about disappearing, like whether it's people or ideas or movements or it's in its very nature it is to disappear them, and that makes researching them particularly hard, or talking about them, or in any way. And I think so finding any audience is in fact sort of a task in and of itself, because finding these things, whether they're objects, whether they are stories, whether they are people's voices, whether they are in fact people, and showing them to people is the task. And anyone is a good one, in my opinion. And what I think is interesting about Prison Pandemic is there has been so many audiences, whether it be sort of the academic papers we're writing, which allow people to sort of recreate or give people instructions on how to recreate parts of what we did, like our outreach process, et cetera, so the ethical frameworks we've implemented, or whether it's, the college students here, or the community that we invited for the opening, the previously incarcerated people, or if it's criminologists in San Francisco, right? I think the task of like prison abolition and is so vast and huge that I think targeting so many different people very intentionally is very important. And like how we go about it is pretty intentional. Like I don't think well, I take that back. Maybe criminologists hopefully did respond well to the exhibit. I think they really did. But like, I don't know, I don't think your average person on the street is gonna enjoy our article in like sociological methodology, right? I'm not sure that's gonna have an impact. But I think, yeah, this was a cool thing that allowed us to have so many different ideal audiences. Because in my opinion, any audience on this subject is ideal.
I mean, I think one of the things I'll talk about with teaching is that there's sort of this myth that everyone is your audience. It's like everyone is not your audience. Just be honest about that. But I think one of the exciting things about poetic justice is being able to engage with the colleagues and their students from different units, and that even in a large research university, just because people are so busy in their own discipline, they don't always, like, quite literally walk across the bridge. And one of the most exciting programs we did when Affective Resistance was up was a program with the performance artist Alexis and the Underground Scholars, and we brought 3 members of the Underground Scholars to the work. None of whom are practicing artists. 2 of whom were permanently incarcerated, and 1 of whom lived out was imprisoned. And Rafa's work was a performance called Bust, a meditation on freedom, where he's inside a cast concrete column, and over the course of 2 hours, he chisels himself out. The documentary is a 5-minute cell phone video taken from the process, but he was talking about it. It was just this really incredible program. This kind of didn't have the hierarchy of kind of like academic curator theorizing artists' work, but they were just kind of talking about their experiences in like Rafa and Rowland and CLS, and talking about just like his fear doing the performance of like, I don't want, like, I'm the only one in my brother's case who's been arrested. I don't want my mom to, like, I don't want to get arrested doing the performance, but I think it's important to do this performance. And like, he had relatives that were on the inside, across from the downtown, I forget the name of the facility, the jail in downtown Los Angeles, which is Chinatown.
He does it across the street from the jail, right?
Yep, with all these like bail bonds places
Yeah.
in the background. So all these cop cars are coming out the whole time as he's doing the performance, and he's this block, and just kind of the vulnerability of his body, and talking about just the physicality of the performance, and hearing people just respond to it from a human perspective rather than our perspective. Felt like that program was really powerful, and just the sense of community and audience. But I think for us, we want to bring people outside of the arts into the space to have these conversations, because ultimately, like, a lot of the work that we're
Like, they weren't gonna let us mount the phones on their walls. Like, that was one of the hang-ups. And so we had to, like, there were all these rules about how we could potentially be onto the walls, or like where we could do them, and like where electrical sockets were and stuff, because it was not designed for this. It was designed for people to sell books in. And so we had to like bring our own literal walls, right? It's like we borrowed the aesthetics of the cube, right? Like, so, and those were a tool in that moment, because it allowed us to communicate the thing that we wanted to. And so in that time, that opportunity, that space, although it resembled the threatening lab, the aesthetic of the threatening lab to a certain extent, I think it was used in a way that was pretty, I would hope it was received in ways that felt counter to the history of that aesthetic and some of the emotions that it brings up for people.
I always think about this myself in all the projects I create, whether it's again oral history or art projects, is that how can the community access this student feel comfortable in that space? And I think that's always in conflict. I think in some ways, when I work with formerly incarcerated people, they're happy to see it in these spaces that have this kind of elevated sense of meaning and importance, that there is this outside institutions giving it some sort of authority, but then is it giving it to authority in a sense where then they they themselves and their communities and their families are now the outsiders in their own narratives and their own stories and representations of themselves. And I think that's a constant conflict that I'm going to try to negotiate forever about how to come to terms with that, how to create other projects. I love in the future we can make it happen, like the mobility of our like walls and phones is that we could just take it almost anywhere and put it in different spaces that don't have to be in the box of space and art, and still have people interact with it in some ways, and just trying to think about, I mean, I'm so happy we sent the books back inside prison. Like, how do we keep on sending, like, communicating back and not just making these objects for ourselves within the, like, university setting and space?
I mean, I guess in response to your question, which is a really good question, it's sort of, so pretty much every institutional space that we work in is on a certain trajectory of that historical evolution of some, you know, kind of European modern formation of bordering, territory, bodies, natural resources. I mean, we are literally seeing these units of world building at stake in our political discourse today. I mean, there's just literally, I'm just thinking about, well, what would the work have been to install these artists' work outside of this dedicated gallery space? If there were the time and resources for it, I'm sure there is a theory and a technique and a rationale for why one would do that and what the aims might be, right? But I guess what I'm saying, like, I guess what I'm saying is that, like, a project like Poetic Justice is at a certain moment, just as the Locked Down, Locked Up exhibition is sort of seizing on a demand and sort of testing the experimental nature and the reference to the space of the lab is precisely to create a space where we can test the limits of certain presumptions of what we know and how we interact. That modality of testing and experimentation is an activity that is, for better or for worse, a part of this history that you're referring to, and yet when people come together to seize on a certain moment and a certain demand, it might be that the lab that we might refer to as a kind of, you know, social experimentalism that we find in the communities that we come from, or the places in LA or Oakland or what have you, we see the social life of these limits being tested, and how can we sort of not necessarily replicate or just simply import that into a carceral space like a gallery or a confined, very disciplined space like that, but perform or extend the performance of that social experimentalism in this place that we are, and that's my hope for it. I don't know that there's a different way, because I'm sure that any other more critical, performative exhibition of a creative work outside of a gallery space, at least on this campus, would, we could think of the encampments as a sort of practice of that social experimentation. You know, they will be just as temporary and provisional and open as I hope an exhibit like this is. So. Wow. Oh, we're over time. The conversation just started, but I really just want to thank everybody who came to be a part of the discussion and really appreciate the work and the occasion that art affords us to come together in these kinds of discussions.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.